All right, Rabbi, say good morning. Let us begin. I'm sorry for the few moment delay. Technical difficulties. Okay, Rabbi, say let us begin. We begin by thanking our sponsors for this morning's shir. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Sivan, Baruch Meir and Rina Dubin in the Schus of Refuah Shalema for their niece Chavetzi Pora Bas Chaya Malka. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, she together with Kol Cholei Yisrael have a complete and enduring refuah. We thank our Daf Yomi sponsor Chaim Rabenstein in memory of Baruch Naftali Ben Achaver Moshe Zichron Livracha. With that, let us begin. We have a beautiful daf ahead of us today. Today's daf is Pei Zayin 87. And we are picking up in Meretz Hashem on Pei Vav Amud Beis 86b. We actually left off a couple of lines before the Mishnah. So we left off kind of at the best part of the sugya. We were learning about yesterday the sugya of Ma'aser Rishon and how again that Ma'aser Rishon, originally the property of the Leviim, was then given over to the Kohanim. It's given over to the Kohanim. And again, the reason for that was a penalty for the Leviim in that they did not go ahead and join Ezra in a return to Eretz Yisrael to rebuild the second Beis Hamikdash. So the Gemara says as follows. The Gemara says, Minalon, Delo Saliku Bimei Ezra. So we are now in the 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12 lines up from the bottom on 86b. Pei Vav Amud Beis. So the Gemara says, Minalon Delo Saliku Bimei Ezra. How do we know that the Leviim did not come up with Ezra? How do we know that? Because again, the Gemara quotes the pasuk, "V'kabtseim el anar haba el ava v'nachan hasham yomim shlosha va'avina ba'am." So Ezra's talking about the fact that they were kind of like I guess what we'll call like a staging area or a gathering point. And Ezra said, I looked at the people and I realized va'avina ba'am uba kohanim. I saw the Am. Am refers to Israel. I saw the Kohanim. B'nei Levi lo matzasi sham. And literally Ezra says, I didn't find any Leviim. Pretty dramatic. I did not find any Leviim amongst the group. The Gemara goes on and says, good. Amrav Chisda b'tchila hayu ma'amidim shotrim ela min ha'Leviim. In the beginning, they used to establish shotrim. Shotrim also were like the officers of the court. So officers of the court used to be appointed from the tribe of Levi. Shneimar v'shotrim ha'Leviim lifnechem. Achshav in ma'amidim shotrim ela miYisrael. But now we only appoint shotrim officers from Yisrael. From Yisrael shneimar v'shotrim harbe barashechem. Good. I will say that concludes the sugya. We now come to the Mishnah. I will say it's a really fascinating Mishnah over here. Bas Yisrael, shenises lekohen. So if a Bas Yisrael marries a Kohen, so this is actually still continuing on the topic of Truma, but giving a little bit of an interesting twist on it. So Bas Yisrael, shenises lekohen, if a Bas Yisrael went ahead and married a Kohen, tochal b'truma. So we'll say, good, step one, straightforward. Bas Yisrael marries a Kohen, she can eat Truma. Mace, what happens if the Kohen dies? V'lohem enu ben. But remember again, she has a son. So a woman marries a Kohen, right? Husband dies, but she has a son from her Kohen husband. We know what the halacha is. So tochal b'truma. Ultimately, the presence of the son, the existence of the son, enables her to continue to eat Truma even after her Kohen husband has passed away. Okay, we'll say now watch this. Nises LeLevi, she then remarries. Who does she remarry? She remarries a Levi. So what's the halacha? Tochal b'maiser. She's permitted to eat Ma'aser Rishon. Right now, again, I will say, so the truth is, anyone's permitted to eat Ma'aser Rishon. But again, the idea over here is, now she's married to a Levi. Now I will say, now just to be clear, this is the same woman, right? So we'll call her Rachel. Rachel marries husband number one, Kohen. They have a son. Husband number one dies. She's permitted to continue to eat Truma by dint of the son. Rachel now gets remarried. Mazel tov. She marries a Levi. Once she marries the Levi, I will say, what's the halacha? She can now eat Ma'aser Rishon. What can't she eat? She can't eat Truma. Marriage to Levi, she can't eat Truma. Fine, Tochal b'Maiser. Mace. Now we'll say, now what happens? Levi dies, but before Levi dies, she has a child with Rachel, right? So now Rachel has a second son. It doesn't have to be a son, a second son, right? And this son is a Levi. So Mace v'lai menubein Tochal b'Maiser. Even after the death of Levi's husband, Rachel can continue to eat Ma'aser. Why? By dint of her son, right? She has a Levitic son. she can continue to eat Meiser. Okay, good. Nises li Yisrael. Okay, Rachel's a determined woman. Right, so what happens now? She marries a third time. Now she's married to a Yisrael, regular guy. So we'll say, what's the halacha? Lo sochal b'truma, v'lo b'meiser. So we'll say, so again, at this point in time now, she obviously, Mishnah doesn't have to say she can't eat truma, because that's kind of obvious that she can't eat truma. She can't eat truma. She also can't eat meiser, even though she was eating meiser up until this point in time. Now she's married to Yisrael, she can't eat truma, can't eat meiser. So I'll say, so now what happens? She has a child with Yisrael, with the Yisrael, and then what happens? Mace, he dies, v'lo yemenu ben, lo socha b'truma, v'lo b'meiser. So we'll say now the end of this story is Rachel's been married 3 times to Cohen, Levi, Yisrael. She has 3 sons, Cohen, Levi, Yisrael. At the end of this story, what is she allowed to eat? What is she allowed to eat? A chulin, right? There's still plenty to eat, don't worry, right? There's still plenty to eat, but she's not allowed to eat truma, and she's not allowed to eat meiser. Now watch this. That's part 1 of the story. Watch this. Meis binami Yisrael. I will say now what happens, son number 3 dies, right? That was the son from Yisrael. That's right, son from Yisrael dies, tochal b'meiser. So I will say, remember again, if son from Yisrael dies, then what happens? She reverts back to the status of Levi, and she can eat meiser. Meis binami Levi, if her son from Levi dies, tochal b'truma. Because also remember again, this works backwards as well. So if her son from Levi dies, then she's permitted to eat truma, because remember again, it's obvious. Meis binami Kohen, what happens if her son from Kohen dies? Then in that case, I will say, lo sochal b'truma, v'lo b'meiser. And then I will say, in that case, again, she's back to square 1. She can't eat truma, she can't eat meiser. Fascinating case. Again, I will say, very intuitive, but just walks us through all the steps. Top of Pei Zayin. So I will say, case number 1 was a Bas Yisrael. Watch this. Case number 2 is a Bas Kohen. So Bas Kohen sheni says li Yisrael. If a Bas Kohen married a Yisrael, so I will say, what's the halacha? Lo socha b'truma. So I will say, so now remember, Bas Kohen marries a Yisrael. So as a Bas Kohen, she herself is entitled to eat truma. Now she marries Yisrael. By virtue of her marriage to the Yisrael, no truma. She gives it up, right? Meis v'lo yemenu ben. Suppose this is a reverse case. Watch this. So Bas Kohen marries Yisrael. They have a child. Now what happens? Husband dies. Yisrael husband dies. So we'll say, what's the halacha? Lo socha b'truma. So remember again, the fact that now she has a Yisrael child will prevent her from eating truma even after the death of her husband. I will say, remember again, normally, if you have a Bas Kohen who marries a Yisrael and she is widowed or divorced, then halacha l'maaseh she goes back to her father's home, could continue to eat truma. We're going to see this in the Gemara. Now, because she has a son with Yisrael, she has a son with her Yisrael, she has a son with her Yisrael husband. Once he dies, her son is still there, can't eat truma. Good. Nises leLevi. So I will say, what happens now? She goes ahead and she gets married to the Levi. Tochal b'meiser. Ultimately, again, she could eat meiser. Fine, she's married to a Levi. So we'll say, what happens? Again, has a son with Levi. Meis v'lo yemenu ben. So now Levi dies, but leaves behind the child. Tochal b'meiser. Ultimately, again, she's permitted to eat meiser by virtue, by dint of the son. Nises leKohen. Rabbi say now third marriage. So again, Rabbi say in case number 2 of the Bas Kohen, the order of the marriages are reversed because those are the more dramatic cases. Husband number 3 is a Kohen. Tochal b'truma. She's permitted to eat truma. Meis v'lo yemenu ben. What happens if he dies? Right, but before he died, they had a child, and so now what's the halacha? Tochal b'truma. Ultimately, again, she can continue to eat truma. So we'll say, so it's just the reverse case. Bas Kohen was eating truma, marries Yisrael, can't eat truma, has a son, husband dies, still can't eat truma. Marries a Levi, could eat meiser, has a son, Levi dies, could continue to eat meiser, marries a Kohen. Could eat truma, has a son, Kohen dies, could continue to eat truma. Beautiful. Then I will say, now the unraveling. Meis binami Kohen. So I will say, if son from husband number 3, the Kohen, dies, then what? Lo socha b'truma. She can no longer eat truma. Meis benami Levi, if her son from the Levi dies, lo socha b'meiser, she can't eat meiser. Meis benami Yisrael, then I will say, here's the dramatic piece. If her first son, right, the son she had from Yisrael, if he dies, what? Choseres lebeis aviha. Then I will remember again, this is a Bas Kohen. So she reverts back to her original status. What's her original status? Going back to her father's home, which enables her to what? Eat truma. Al zen ne'emar v'shava al beis aviha kinu areha milechem beis aviha tochal. So we'll say, as the pasuk says, she will return back to her father's home kinu areha, like her youth. Milechem aviha tochal. She will eat from the bread of her father's home. So we'll say, fascinating case. So again, two constructs. Bas Yisrael, who marries Kohen Levi Yisrael, Bas Kohen, who marries Levi Yisrael Kohen. Okay, so the effect of the marriages on her, right? The effect of having children with each of these men, and then unfortunately, Rahman al-Islam, the effect of the death of the husbands, and then the death of the children in the reverse order. Good, straightforward Mishnah. Says the Gemara, but let's analyze. Meis binami Levi tocha b'truma, the hadra achla mishum namila. So we'll say, now let's go back for just a moment. The Mishnah is focusing on the first case, right? First case, which is the Bas Yisrael. So we'll say, so remember again, let's fast forward a little bit. So Bas Yisrael, she marries Kohen Levi Yisrael. She marries Kohen Levi Yisrael, has a son with each of them. Then when the sons die, what happens? Meis binami Levi, when her son from the Levi dies, she's left with one son, right? Who's the one son? Kohen's son. And halacha l'maisa, she can now continue to eat truma. So the Gemara says, the hadra da'achla mishum binami nalan. People say, where do we know this concept that a woman is entitled to eat truma because of her Kohen's son, right? Remember again, the woman herself is a Bas Yisrael. How do I know that she is entitled to continue to eat truma because of her Kohanic son? Rabbi Abba Barav. So the Gemara says, Bas Ubas. So this is actually very interesting. So the pasuk that the Gemara is mentioning over here is the pasuk of Ubas Kohen Kisya Liish Zar. So what's the name of Bas Kohen? If she marries a non-Kohen, she cannot eat consecrated or sanctified items. So the Gemara darshan is like this. Bas means daughter. Ubas, the Gemara is darshaning the Vav is extra, and it teaches us that there's another kind of child that could also help with the truma consumption process. Who is that other kind of child? Who is that other kind of child? If a Bas Yisrael has a child from a Kohen, look at Rashi for just a moment. Bas Ubas. So first of all, look at Rashi for just a moment. Minalon, tizara ha'ocheles b'shvil b'na, v'niseis lezar umeis shechozeres v'ocheles. So I will say, so again, remember, this is actually very interesting. The idea over here is, we're asking actually something a bit more nuanced. It's not just the pshat of how do I know that a woman could eat truma by virtue of her child from a Kohen. What we're asking over here is like this. How do I know that halacha l'maisa, if you have a Bas Yisrael who married a Kohen, had a kid, was eating truma, then married a non-Kohen, lost the ability to eat truma, then was, let's say, widowed from the Yisrael husband, that she can go back and eat truma as a result of her child. Again, look at that Rashi. Minalan tizara ha'ocheles b'shvil b'na. You have a Bas Yisrael who is eating truma because of her Kohanic son. V'niseis lazar. Then she married a non-Kohen, umeis, and he died. Shechozeres v'ocheles. That she can go back. Because we both say there's two pieces over here. The idea that a Bas Yisrael who marries a Kohen, remember you're going to both say, when a Bas Yisrael marries a Kohen, step one is that she eats truma because of her husband. Step two is that she continues to eat truma even if her husband is dead, as long as what? There's a child. We've actually already established that. Now we're asking a bit more nuanced. Now we'll say, in that same case, husband dies, she has a child, she marries a Levi or a Yisrael. It doesn't make a difference. In this case, she marries a Levi. Marries the Levi, loses the right to eat truma. Now what I'm introduced to is Levi dies, Let's assume for a moment, Rabbi say, let's assume right now there's no child from the Levi. Levi dies, she goes back to eating Truma. Remember, the Mishnah's case is more convoluted, right? She has a child with Levi, she has a child with Yisrael, child from Yisrael dies, child from Levi dies, but skipping all of that, how do I know that Allah Chalamaysa, when the non-Kohen husband dies, she goes back to eating Truma? So I'll say that's in the Gemara. So look at Rashi, Bas Ubas Kohen Kisia Amona Ugrusha. So watch this. So the Gemara says, Kid Rabbi Akiva, the Darish Vavi. Rabbi say Rabbi Akiva darshins Vavs. Right? Rabbi Akiva in general darshins Vavs throughout Shas. So the idea over here that Rabbi Akiva sees the Ubas. So the Ubas teaches me that there is another case of a child, another case of a bas or a ben, who allows the mother to consume truma. What's that case? That's the case of where there is a Kohanic child, even though the mother subsequently marries someone else, a non-Kohen, was widowed, the existence of the Kohanic child then allows her to resume truma consumption. Rabbanon, will say the truth is, even the Rabbanon who don't normally go ahead and darshan vavin, they also will agree. Why? Because kula ubas kra yiseruhu. Will say the truth is, this entire pasuk is extraneous, and because it's extraneous, therefore it could be used for a drasha. And the drasha of the pasuk is that even if the woman remarried after the death of her Kohanic husband, once her second husband dies, the presence or the existence of the Kohen child allows her to continue to eat truma. So I will say, this is a really incredible. So this is the nuanced halacha. This is the chiddush of the Mishnah. As much as we said the Mishnah was straightforward, the chiddush of the Mishnah, I will say, was I would have thought that when a woman marries a Kohen, she eats truma. Good, everyone agrees. She has a child from the Kohen, and Kohen dies. She continues to eat truma. No disagreement there. What's the chiddush? The chiddush is now she marries a Levi, no longer can eat truma. The chiddush is that when Levi dies, she can go back to eating truma. That's the chiddush, Abosai, because I would have thought, look, once you're out, you're out. That would have been, and again, logical havamina. Kamash malon, no. Once Levi dies again, and Levi's kid dies, or there's no kid from Levi, she goes. In other words, once she's back in her state where it's only her and her Kohanic child, even though she's been married a number of times subsequent, she can go back to eat truma. That's the chiddush. Where do I learn it out from? The phrase ubas, either I'm darshaning the vav or the entire pasuk. Beautiful. So we'll say, let's go back to Tan Rabbanon. Kishi chozeres. Now we'll say, now watch this. When she goes back, now we'll say, now this is talking about a different kind of situation. This is talking about halacha lamaisa. Back in that same pasuk, ubas kohen kisia almono grusha. Supposed to say the pasuk that we're talking about over here is a bas kohen who gets married. Or she gets married, and let's say she marries a Yisrael or a Levi for that matter. And then what happens? She's widowed or divorced. She has no children from her marriage. So the Torah says, "V'shava al beis avia kinu oral." She goes back to her father's home, like her youth. And what happens? Milechem avia tochal. She could eat from the bread of her father's home. The chol yochaval. Good. So I'll say. So now here's what's interesting. When she goes back to her father's home, so Bas Kohen now goes back home, which means she could eat like the rest of our Kohanic family. Listen to this. Kishi chozeres l'truma ve'enu chozeres l'chazei b'shok. Fascinating. She can go back and she could eat truma. What can she eat? The chazei and shok. So let's remember again, a Kohen gets the chest and the foreleg of an animal. Right? So you shecht an animal, the Kohen gets the chazei v'shok. Right? So now what we're saying is this girl, or this woman, when she comes back to her father's home, she doesn't get to eat everything. She gets to eat truma, but she does not get chazei v'shok. Okay, why not? How do you know that? In other words, I will say in general, we kind of treat matnos kahuna the same. So how do you know that she doesn't eat chazei v'shok? So I will say, listen to this. Amrav Chisda Amravina Bar Shila Maikra, he b'trumas hakadashim lo sochal. Because I will say the pasuk says, she shall not eat of the trumas hakadashim. Okay, so b'muram min hakadashim lo sochal. She can't eat that which is separated from consecrated items. So the chazei v'shok, right, which is a sacrificial part, that she can't eat. She can't eat that. So the Gemara says, Rav Nachman Amar Bar Avua, milechem v'lo kol lechem. Well, this is very interesting. The pasuk says she can go back to her father's home and she can eat milechem, from the bread. Milechem teaches me what? From the bread and not all of the bread, which means some of the Kohanic portions, but not all of the Kohanic portions. So prat lechazei v'shok teaches me that she can eat truma, but she can't eat chazei v'shok. Maskif l'rayim bar chama ema prat lahafaras nedarim. Maybe not. In other words, we'll say, here's what I know, right? What is the Torah trying to convey to me? That when she goes back to her father's home, as much as there's a resumption of certain things, not everything goes back to the way it was. Right? That's what we're analyzing over here. I'll say not everything goes back to the way that it was. So we suggested that maybe what it means is she could eat truma, can't eat chazei v'shok. Maybe not. Maybe it means that when she goes back to her father's home, ultimately what? Father doesn't have the ability to annul her vows. I'll say, by the way, what a profound Musar Haskell in this, right? What the Gemara is highlighting over here is that often in life there are events that change relationships. And when those events occur, what we want more than anything is for our relationships to go back to what they were prior to the event. And I always say, it's ma'asim b'chol yom, right? It happens all the time in Shalom Bayis, right? The couple has a significant falling out or a significant issue over something. And then again, Baruch Hashem, they're able to reconcile. And there's that desire of like, Chadei Shamenu Kikedem, let's go back. And I will say the interesting part about relationships is where there is a trauma or there is a dramatic change, you cannot put things back to what they were prior to the event. It's an important yesod because often people are frustrated because they want to reclaim what was. It doesn't work. By the way, it's not just true in marriage, it's true in friendships, it's true in many different relationships. When there is a fissure in the relationship, when there is a breakage, when there's a stress or a trauma, you could rebuild and you could repair, but the relationship often becomes something different. And by the way, that's not bad. It's not bad. It's just different. It's just different. And sometimes it can become better. Sometimes it can become stronger. But again, sometimes that desire to make it what it was often becomes an exercise in futility and frustration. And such an incredible yesod. That's what the Gemara is saying over here. This girl was a Bas Kohen, right? She goes back to her father's home. So like the Havamina is, she goes back, and what's the relationship like? What's the relationship like? Like what it was before. No, there's nothing in life like that goes back exactly to what it was before. I will say, by the way, if you think about this, someone once mentioned this to me. Even when you think about when we say Chadei Shamenu Kikedem, right, or Kishanim Kadmonios, I will say the truth is, I just want to point out, if you learn Navi like for 4 minutes, right, so I will say it's not so clear that like we want to go back to what it was. Right? It's not so pashut. Even when we say, Chadei Shamenu Kikedem, we're referring to certain aspects. In other words, I'd like a Beis Hamikdash. That's what I want. I'd like a Davidic king, right? I'd like Jewish unity. I'm not saying take me back to what, because the truth is often what wasn't exactly so great, and the truth is what was can't really be replicated. So the Havamina here is ultimately she goes back to what was. Kamashwa, no. Something's going to be different. So what's different? So let's listen to this. No. But say we all know her father, even when she gets divorced or widowed and goes back to her father's home, she cannot go ahead. Father cannot go ahead and annul her vows. But say, where do we know this from? The Tana Rabbi Yishmael. V'neder almana ugrusha yakum aleh. The neder of a widow or a divorcee, yakum aleh, will be upheld. So what is coming to teach us? V'lo mutza michlal av umutza michlal baal. Shabbos, here's what's interesting about a widow and a divorcee. They have no man in their life to go ahead and control their vows, because such a woman is removed from her father's home. And remember again, there is no husband in the picture, to which the Gemara says, Ela harishem masara av l'shluchei habal. Listen to this. For example, let's say once the father hands over his daughter to the agents of the husband. Let's say a father's marrying off his daughter, and ultimately there are shluchim, there are agents of the husband who are coming to take her to the chuppah. So once father hands her off to the shluchei habal, O shemasu shluchei av l'shluchei abal. And I will say, or for that matter again, father's agents hand her off to husband's agents. V'nis armala onis garsha baderech. And let's say, Rebosai, she is widowed or divorced on the road. Hey, so the Gemara says, Heichani koriba beis avia shalzu, o beis baila shalzu, elalomer lacha, kevan shiyatza sha'achas mirasho sa'av, shuv eno yachal lahaver. So I will say, the Gemara is saying, it's obvious that when she's widowed or divorced, and it says she goes back to her father's home, it's obvious that that does not mean for vow annulment purposes. Why? Because I will say, the moment a girl leaves her father's domain, even before she enters her husband's home, Lemaisa, he has lost the ability to annul her vows. And once you lose that ability, that right never returns. So Rav Safra Amar, so I will say, so therefore again, remember, what do we focus on over here? We're focused on the statement of the Braisa that says that halacha lemaisa, when a woman, a Bas Kohen, is widowed or divorced and goes back to her father's home, she can eat truma. What can't she eat? Chazei v'shok. And we're just trying to figure out exactly where do we know that from? Where do you know that from? So the Gemara says, Rav Safra Amar milechem avia tochal. So also the pasuk says, from the lechem of her father's home she'll eat lechem below basar. That's a pretty straightforward drasha, right? The pasuk says explicitly, she will eat from the lechem. What doesn't she eat from the lechem? Truma. What isn't lechem? What isn't lechem? And that's an open-ended question, right? What isn't lechem? Basar. So therefore, again, she doesn't eat chazei b'shog. Rapabar mi lechem avia tochal lechem hakanoi la'avia. What kind of lechem does she eat? Rabbi will say the kind of lechem that is acquired by her father. Rabbi will say, what does that mean? Truma. Rabbi will say, truma is property of who? Property of who? The Kohen. So Rabbi will say, it says mi lechem avia tochal, from the lechem of her father, which means she eats from that which belongs to her father. Truma belongs to a Kohen. Chazei prat lechazei v'shok t'mishulchan gavoaz kazachu. What's actually very interesting? Chazei v'shok is fascinating. Is not considered to be the property of the Kohen. Isn't that interesting? Chazei v'shok is considered to be the property of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and the Ribono Shel Olam allows the Kohanim to eat at his table, which we will say is such a beautiful, beautiful idea. So there are certain matnos kuna, there are certain Kohanic gifts which become the property of the Kohen, right? It's the Kohen's property, Truma. And then there are certain things which the Kohen is permitted to consume, but Lamaisa, he doesn't have ownership over them. Rather, he's an invited guest of the Ribono Shel Olam. The example of that, Chazei v'shog. So what is Bas Kohen permitted to eat when she returns to her husband's home, father's home? From that which her father owns, i.e. Truma. What can't she eat? Chazei v'shog. Incredible. V'rava Amar ves chazei atnufa v'shog truma tochelu ato uvanecha uvanosecha itcha. So the pasuk says. So the pasuk, when talking about the chazei v'shok, the Torah says you could eat it, your son could eat it, your daughter could eat it. Itach, with you. Bisman she'itach. Ultimately, again, I will say the halacha is, when can your daughter eat it with you? When she is with you. In other words, I will say, but once she has left the home and no longer lives with you, even if she comes back, she cannot eat the chazei v'shok. Incredible. So the Gemara says as follows: Amar Avad bar Abba Tana ki she chozeres labeis aviha chozeres letruma ve'eno chozeres lechazei v'shok. So Avad bar Abba says this as a declarative statement as well, that halacha l'maisa, when she returns to her father's home, she can eat truma, but she can't eat chazei v'shok. The Gemara says b'shvil bina chozeres af lechazei v'shok. Oh, this is interesting. So Rabbi say, now watch this. What we've established, and pretty much everyone agrees with this concept, is halacha l'maisa, when a woman, right, Bas Kohen, gets married to a Yisrael, right, she gets divorced or widowed, no children, halacha l'maisa, she comes back to her father's home, she could eat truma, she can't eat chazei v'shok. Everyone's agreeing with that. I will say, watch this next case. In this next case over here, let's say I will say a Bas, it doesn't really matter, a Bas Yisrael or a Bas Kohen for that matter, marries a Kohen, they have a child. So I will say the presence of the child allows the woman to what? Eat truma, but not only that, ultimately, again, b'shvil b'na, chozeres af lechazei v'shok. If she has a child, the child enables her to eat chazay v'shok as well. Fascinating. So the Gemara says, Azal Rav Mordechai Amr l'shmaita kamed Rav Ashi. When Rav Mordechai came along and he said over this ruling in front of Rav Ashi, Amr mehecha kamis Rabia. Where do you know this from? Where do you know this from? So the Gemara says, me ubas. So ultimately, I learn it out from either I will say the extra vav, right, the vav, or ultimately, again, like we said before, perhaps the entire pasuk is extraneous. So the Gemara says, I don't understand. Mi adifa la mina. So I will say, I don't understand. Why is it that the mother of a Kohanic child has greater rights than a Bas Kohen? Right? Remember again, what did we just establish? The mother of a Kohanic child can not only continue to eat truma, but what else could she continue to eat? Right? Chazay v'shok. Yet a Bas Kohen, who's widowed or divorced, returns back to her father's home, she could eat truma, but she can't eat chazay v'shok. Why? I will say, and by the way, I can even make a stronger. The reason why it's strange because their entitlements should technically be the same. Also, remember, it's also strange because the mother of a Kohen may not be what? May not be a Bas Kohen herself. She could be Yisraelis, and yet she could eat chazay v'shok. And yet a Bas Kohen, who is originally part of a Kohanic family, when she returns, can only eat truma, can't eat chazay v'shok. To which the Gemara says it's simple. Hasam ksivi miute, hachalo ksivi miute. In the case of the Bas Kohen, I will say there are certain exclusionary phrases that are written or words. In the case of the mother of the Kohen, there is no such exclusion. Okay, so therefore I will say bottom line halacha l'maisa comes out of the sugya, which is really interesting, that if a Bas Kohen is widowed or divorced and goes back to her father's home, she can eat truma, she can't eat chazay v'shok. However, again, if she has, but the mother of a Kohanic child, ultimately, again, could continue to eat truma as a result of her son, and could also eat chazay v'shok. Incredible. Let's go weiter. Bas Kohen shenises li Yisrael. So we'll say, remember again, now the second case in the Mishnah, or the say, called the second framework of the Mishnah, was a Bas Kohen who married a Yisrael. So we'll say, remember again, this was just the opposite construct of the first case. Says the Matar Rabbanon, V'shava al beis aviha, she shall return to her father's home. Prat l'shomeres yavam. So remember again, the Torah says that if a Bas Kohen, right, is widowed or divorced, she could return to her father's home. Now we've established that the nature of that return to her father's home is what? That halacha l'maisa, she can go ahead and eat truma, fine, can't eat chazay v'shok. That's what we've established. Now let's say there are going to be certain exceptions where even if a Bas Kohen is widowed or divorced, she could physically go back to her father's home, but halacha l'maisa, she does not get the rights of her father's home just yet. For example, v'shaval beis aviyah, prat l'shomeres yavam. So I will say, watch this. Let's say you have a Bas Kohen. Her husband died without children, and there are surviving brothers. She's waiting for yibum or chalitza. While she's a shomeres yavam waiting for yibum or chalitza, she quote unquote doesn't return to her father's home. So she does not have a resumption of those Kohanic rights. Kinu areha, like her youth, prat l'meuberes. Another exception, if she's pregnant. Let's say she's pregnant with her now deceased husband's child. The pregnancy prevents her from returning back to her home. Valo dinhu, the Gemara says, I don't understand. Let's make a kavachomer. Uma b'makom shelo asa vlad min harishon kid vlad min hashin lepocha min hayibum. But in a situation where we don't make the offspring of the first husband, we don't say that the offspring of the first husband is like the offspring of the second husband to exempt her from yibum. Now, what does that mean? Take a look at Rashi over here. Rashi's in the wide lines. Third wide line down. Valo dinhu. We'll say, watch this. But lama likra, uma b'makom shelo asa vlad min harishon kid vlad min hasheni. We'll say now in a situation where we didn't make the child of the first husband like the child of the second husband. What does that mean? Meaning, nises le'echad v'yaldalo. We'll say, watch this. Right, Bas Kohen marries her husband, has a child, umes, and then ultimately again he dies. V'nises la'achar umes below banim. And I will say, now what happens? So we'll say this is a different kind of case. So watch this. Rachel marries Cohen. We'll just go with this case. Right? Rachel's Bas Cohen, she marries Yisrael. Okay, she has a child with Yisrael. Yisrael dies. She then goes and marries Levi. It doesn't have to be this case for the illustration, but we'll just keep the illustrations the same. We'll say now she marries Levi. Watch this. Levi dies. Levi dies without children. Is Rachel subject to Yibum? Yes. Why? Because Levi died without children. Also remember again, the din of Yibum has nothing to do with whether or not Rachel has children, but has everything to do with whether or not the deceased husband has children. So even though in this case it's interesting, Rachel, who has a child from husband number 1, will still be subject to Yibum because husband number 2 died without children. So we'll say that's the meaning of the phrase over here. Listen to this. So the Gemara says, Makom, I'm sorry, Valo Dinhu. In a situation where offspring of the first husband does not count for offspring of the second husband, right? When husband number 2 dies without children, even though Rachel has a son from husband number 1, she is going to be subject to Yibum. Lebocha min Yibum. Asa ubar ki yilud. Yet Rabbi say in that same case, we will make, if she's pregnant, that is equivalent to going ahead and having a baby, which means what Rabbi say, that halacha l'maisa, if she's pregnant from husband number 2, that is going to preclude her return back to her father's home for all types of rights. Makom sha'asa vlad min harishon kid vlad min hasheni leposla min hatruma. Then ultimately, and I will say in a situation where offspring from the first husband will count in a second marriage, i.e., to preclude her from eating truma, as we've seen before, ultimately, again, certainly being pregnant should have the equivalent of having a child as well. So I will say, to which the Gemara says, no. Mali asa uber ki yilud le'inyin yibum. I will say that's different. In other words, because we're going ahead and treating the uber pregnancy like as if she had a child regarding yibum, shari asa mesim kechayim. Because I will say Yibum is different. Why is Yibum different in general? Because by Yibum we treat the dead like they are alive. What does that mean? Take a look at Rashi. Third line out from the bottom. Le'inyon Yibum as shari asa mesim kechayim meis baila va'achakach meis bina harik charbosei. We're going to talk about this today, and this is absolutely riveting. Watch this. What does it mean that by Yibum we treat the dead like they're living? Let me give you a simple case. Rachel is married to Ruvain. They have a son. Ruvain dies. Obligation of Yibum? No. Let's say son dies. Rabbi say, now what? Is there a retroactive obligation of Yibum? Now, at the end of the day, Ruvain died, and he died without children. So Rabbi say, the Gemara says, no. Although we're going to challenge that fact in just a moment. But Lamai says, no. So Rabbi say, that's what it means when we say that by Yibum, shari asa mesim kechayim. The dead are like they are alive, which means that even if Ruvain's son dies, now again, obviously, if Ruvain's son died before Ruvain, that's a different discussion. But assuming Ruvain dies, his son outlives him, and the son dies a year later, there's still no din of Yibum. Asa mesim kechayim. So the Gemara goes back there. I'm sorry. Let me just finish. So, Mali asa uber kilo le'inyan yibum shari yibum. Sorry, le'inyan yibum shari asa mesim kechayim naase uber kiyilud le'inyan truma shelo asa mesim kechayim. Should we go ahead and treat the pregnancy as if she had birthed a child by truma? Because the truma Rabbi say we don't count the dead as if they are alive. Talmud lomar kinu arha prat lemeuberes. Therefore, Rabbi say we do need the pasuk ultimately again to teach us kinu arha, like her youth, which means that if the Bas Kohen is pregnant, she is not able to go back to her father's home and go ahead and resume having all of those rights. And I will say the truth is, we need both of these exceptions. We need to go ahead and teach the case of Me'uberes and the case of no children. Why? Because if it would have said she doesn't have children, I would have thought like this. The Gemara says, Meikara chad gufa, in the beginning, when she was living in her father's home, it was one body. In other words, she was without child, it was one body. V'hashta tre gufi, but now ultimately again, there are two bodies. Aval me'uberes, the meikara, because she has a child. V'hashta tre gufe, aval me'uberes, the meikara chad gufa, v'hashta chad gufa, imateichal. But in the case of Uberes, I will say where what? She had one body, she was one body before, and ultimately, even now, though she's pregnant, she has one body now. As I will say, this is, by the way, this Gemara, we're doing this on Shavuos night, and Hashem, this is our topic. I will say, it's fascinating how the Gemara treats a pregnancy over here. Ultimately, again, it calls the pregnancy still one body, which I will say echoes or I should say highlights a halachic sentiment that a fetus does not have an independent identity from its mother. Uber yarech imohu. It's one body. The baby's not fetus is not an independent entity. It's part of its mother. So the Gemara says, Teichol. I would have thought, therefore, Allah Chalamaisa, she should be able to eat. Therefore, tzricha. Because of Rachmana Mu'uberes, to make Kara Gufa. And if we were just at the case of Mu'uberes, I would have thought like this, to make Kara Gufa. On the base, Srika is right in the beginning, she was an empty body. V'hashka Gufa Mleya. And now she's a full body with the pregnancy. Aval Zera Ein La. But the Pasuk says, Zera Ein La de Me'ikara Gufa Srika, V'hashka Gufa Srika. Before she was an empty body, now she's an empty body as well. Because she already gave birth. Eimalo. I would have thought no. Therefore, tzricha. Therefore, we'll say both cases are necessary. Good. The Gemara then gives an amanik. I will say we're going to do this piece quickly. We'll get to the new parak in Meretz Hashem before we run out of time. So the Gemara gives an amanik. Skip down to the second lines. Amar Rabbi Yehuda midi iskarta l'Rava. Lo naasa mesim kechayim le'inyim mekavachomer. I will say let's go back for just a moment. Remember I mentioned this before. The chiddush, not the chiddush, but the interesting idea or the interesting formulation by Yibum is by Yibum, we make the dead like they are living. How do you accomplish that? The idea over here is that Allah for Yibum, all we need is that at the time that the husband died, there was living offspring. If the offspring subsequently dies, that does not trigger a retroactive need for Yibum. So the Gemara wants to challenge this assertion. The Gemara wants to say, Lo na'aseh mesim kechayim linyim mikavachomer. The truth is no. Look at Rashi. Lo na'aseh mesim kechayim v'tachzer l'zekasa im Yevamos b'no la'achrazon. I will say, by the way, can you imagine if that was that? If we actually did this, can you imagine this? Essentially, I will say, a woman who was widowed without children, a woman who was widowed with children, essentially, would never be able to remarry. Because we'll say what that would mean is, if her child chasum would ever die, that would trigger the zika again. And make her subject to, which would just be fascinating. In any event, leaving aside the practicality of it, the Gemara is saying, no, let's go ahead and say the dead are not like the living. And therefore, should chas v'shalom, the child of the deceased husband die, that would trigger a zika again and make her subject to yibum even years down the line. And make it a kavachomer. What's the kavachomer? Uma b'makom sha'asa vlad min harishon ki vlad min hasheni leposa min hatruma. Rabbi was saying in a situation where offspring from the first husband, right, becomes like offspring of the second husband to pass her from truma. Rabbi will say what that means is that halacha l'maisa, that offspring from a first marriage will have an impact even during a second marriage, as we've seen that Allah Chalamayis, I will say, remember again, she has a child. She has a child from one marriage, and that will preclude her from eating truma, even if she's right, even in a second marriage. Lo asa mesim kechayim. Yet we did not make dead offspring like living offspring. Makom shelo asa vlad min harishon ki vlad min hashen lepocha min hayibum. So both in a situation where we do not make offspring from a first marriage, like offspring from a second marriage, to exempt her from yibum. Eino din shlo nasa mesim kechayim. We certainly should not give the dead the status of the living. So I will say, so therefore, again, that's a pretty cogent argument to say that halacha l'maisa, maybe by yibum, when the child of the deceased husband dies, that should trigger a retroactive obligation of yibum. So I will say, why don't we subscribe to that idea? Listen to this. Talmud Lomar, Teracha darchei noam, v'chol nesivoseh shalom. I will say, this is so incredibly amazing. What an answer. The Gemara doesn't give this is a halachic answer, but the Gemara just says, because you're setting up an impossible situation. I will say, as I mentioned before, imagine for a moment if this was the halacha. Okay, so what happens, right? Rachel's married to Ruvain. Ruvain dies, but they have a child, Baruch Hashem. They have a son. So what happens? Rachel now wants to go on with her life. So imagine for a moment now, if the halacha was that the dead are not treated like the living, which means that now if son dies at some point, that will trigger a retroactive obligation, that will trigger retroactive zika and require her to go ahead and do yibum. Now we'll say, what would be her marital prospects in such a situation? What would be marital prospects? Impossible. Who in their right mind is going to step into a situation like this? The truth is, she in her right mind couldn't step into a situation like this because she has to realize that she may be married and then one day something may occur and halacha l'maisa, she's going to be stuck in a yibum situation. So I will say, this is incredible. So the Gemara's answer is, the Torah Kedosha would never set up a scenario like this. The ways of the Torah are pleasant. So to create a scenario where halacha l'maisa, again, she would have to dissolve a marriage, not be able to enter into a second marriage, live with this doubt over her head, this is not the way of the Torah. I will say such a beautifully profound answer, which I will say in general is something so incredible. Yiddishkeit is beautiful, and Torah is beautiful. And if there's something that I'm doing that is anxiety provoking, or there's something that I'm doing that hurts or doesn't, chances are you're doing it wrong. Chances are you're doing it wrong. Because everything in Yiddishkeit is beautiful. It doesn't mean everything is easy. But everything is beautiful, everything is pleasant. If it's unpleasant, if it's painful, if it's onerous, if it's overwhelming, chances are I'm doing it wrong. So the Gemara goes weiter. Why don't we go ahead and make the dead like the living regarding Truma? So the Gemara says, right, Rashi, let's just go back there. Shabbos say, listen to this. In a situation where we don't make the offspring from the first husband like offspring from the second husband to exempt her from yibum, nevertheless, asa meisim kechayim, in a yibum situation, we treat quote unquote the dead like the living. In a situation where we make the offspring of the first husband like the offspring of the second husband, i.e., the presence of that offspring from the first marriage will preclude her from eating truma. Certainly, again, Kavachomer should make in that case the dead should be accorded the status of living. Tamalomar v'zera ein law. Because the pasuk says she doesn't have offspring, and in this case she literally doesn't have offspring. V'nasa vlad min harishon kivlad min hasheni le'inyin yibum. Rabbi says is actually very interesting. Why don't we make the offspring of the first husband like the offspring of the second husband regarding yibum mikavachomer? Rabbi say, what does that mean? Uma b'makom shelo asa mesim kechaim le'inyin truma asa vlad min harishon kivlad min hasheni. So Rabbi say in a situation where we do not make the dead like the living, right? Regarding truma. Nevertheless, we go ahead and we say the child from the first marriage does have an impact on the second marriage. In a situation where we do treat the dead like the living, i.e. regarding yibum, we certainly should make the offspring of the first husband like this offspring of the second husband. Good. The truma. Shabbos say, why don't we say that the offspring of the first marriage shouldn't have an impact on the second marriage? From a kavachomer, ma b'makom shasa meisim kechayim lepotra min hayibum lo asav la min hashon kavla min hasheni. Shabbos say, listen to this. In a situation where ma b'makom shasa, right, we make the dead like the living in order to exempt her from yibum. Yet, still in that case, we don't treat the offspring of the first marriage like offspring of the second marriage. Ultimately, again, in a situation where we don't accord the dead status of the living regarding truma, then you certainly should not go to make the offspring of the first marriage like the offspring of the second marriage. Talmud lomar ein la v'hayeshla. So I will say again, so going through all the variations, but I just want to point out the beautiful part of this is that the halacha is, as we espoused in the Mishnah, the add-on pieces, Rabbi say, are three major add-on pieces. Number one, when a bas kohen is widowed or divorced without children, she goes back to her father's home for truma, but not for chazei v'shok. Contrast that with a mother of a kohanic child who, after the death of her husband, is able to go ahead and continue to teach truma as well as chazei v'shok. Rabbi say the other piece that we have seen is that halacha l'maisa, if a bas kohen is widowed, she does go back to her father's home. However, not if she's pregnant, and not if she's a shomeres yavam. Then we have to wait ultimately again for the resolution of these situations to see what our ultimate status is. One more piece of Osai, that by Yibum we've established this concept of Mesim Kechayim. Incredible. What a statement. That by Yibum the dead are like the living. Namely, that as long as there is a living child at the time of the death of the husband, the wife is exempt from Yibum. And even if offspring subsequently dies, there is no retroactive zika that is activated. Why not? Why not? Hadrin Allah yesh musara. So we'll say mazel tov, mazel tov, mazel tov. Good. Let's begin. At least we'll read a line. Good. Feels like a ceremonial beginning of the Mishnah. Good. Sa'isha. We'll say, by the way, great sugya ahead of us. Great sugya. Wow. Ha'isha shalach ba'ila medina sayam. We'll say, get ready for this. A woman has a husband who goes overseas. Uba'ova amrullah meis ba'alech. And they come and they tell her, your husband died. V'nises, and she got married. Clearly, she took it very hard, right? So I'll say, so I'll say, so what happened? She waited. No, she waited an hour. And I say, so what happened? So actually, no, we're going to say, we know that halacha l'mais in general, there's the din of havchana, right? She has to wait before getting remarried. But leaving that aside, we'll say, so what's happened over here? Husband goes overseas. Word comes back that husband dies. Now, I both say, now remember again, it says ba'u. Now, ba'u means what? Ba'u means what? They came. We're going to actually see, Abba say that the Gemara is going to explain that halacha l'maisa, this is actually a case of eidechad. This is a case of one witness coming along and going ahead, halacha l'maisa, and telling her, your husband died. So Abba say, all right, Abba say, we'll stop over here for today. And Mira says, okay, good, I gave you the teaser. I'll pick up with the Mishnah tomorrow. Shkoyach. Oof, all right.
We always talked about Europe. Everybody has this ideal view of the Shtef. It's miserable.
Right.
People don't want to go back. If he knew what it was like, he wouldn't want people have this ideal view. And it's Kadeshman of catch.
We always idealize the past.
The nice things about it.
100%.
Dirt floors and
100%.
Trying to figure out what they're going to eat.
It's very true. Michael, you'll start? Or perfect, go. Yeah. Have a great day, man.